Good morning, everybody. We are getting started a couple of minutes late. Can you tell the flu is running through our congregation? A lot of folks out. Of course, Dave is out of town visiting family, Dave and Luann. And Tom, again, was supposed to teach, but he is still under the weather. Terry's got the flu. I think Ray Russell's got the flu. I don't know who all else has it. Oh, hey, Ray. Please don't breathe on me. But I'm glad you're here. Glad you're here. So y'all got to bear with me for one more week until Dave gets back. Romans chapter 14. Turn to Romans chapter 14. In chapter 12, Paul dealt with various moral obligations a Christian has. Then, as we talked about last week in chapter 13, he dealt with political obligations. And in this chapter, he's going to deal with obligations that we have to each other, our fellow Christians, regarding differences of opinion. Now keep in mind, who's this book written to? What's that? Jewish and Gentile Christians, but of that answer, specifically, it's written to Christians, okay? So, as we go through this, we need to keep that in mind, all right? And this chapter doesn't necessarily address the issues that the specific opinions were about. Instead, it talks about issues that are not necessarily issues that are essential, let me put it that way, but rather those that are issues of indifference, if you will. All right? If you think about your history, and if you've been in the church for a long time, and I'm kind of looking at this audience and seeing that the vast majority, if not all of you, have been in the church for a long time. Differing opinions in the church has been something that has plagued the church since the very beginning. I mean, we can read in the Bible of first century Christians that had differences of opinion. It's caused many a church split. And worse than that, it's caused many to leave the church altogether. So this chapter is very, very important for us to study, to understand, and to get it, okay? And again, what's interesting about this chapter is that Paul doesn't try to correct the Christian that's in the wrong, okay, that maybe has the wrong opinion. Now, he has done that in other books, 1 Corinthians, Galatians. He has took on the issue and tried to straighten it out. Rather, he is instructing the other party. He is instructing the Christians that are having to deal with the other Christian that has the differing opinion, okay, and a different understanding of things. And also something I think that's very interesting about this chapter is it talks about the weak brother. And it's referred to in this chapter as not necessarily the one that is overly strict in their opinion of something. Well, I'm sorry. It's talking. Let me read that the way I wrote it. What's even more interesting to me is that the weak brother referred to in this chapter is the one with the overly strict opinion. Okay? Now you think about that. Usually when you have someone in a congregation, you don't necessarily think of them as a weak brother and sister because they're so, I don't want to use the word conservative, but they're so entrenched in the things that they have been taught, have exercised all of their life. So that's the weak brother. It's not the one that is exercising liberty. And we'll talk about what liberty in Christ is as we go along. How many of you are judgmental people and willing to admit it? That's something that's plagued me all of my life. I'm a very judgmental person. Amy reminds me of that all the time. I think I'm getting better. But that's just something that I have, because of my upbringing, I've tended to judge those around me. I've put myself in that position. This chapter, I think, was written for me, and maybe it was written for you. Now, chapter 14 is broken down into two main thoughts. First, we're going to talk about the law of liberty. Then we're going to talk about the law of love. Both of them are tied together and relate to one another. So, chapter 14, verse 1. Paul says, "Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to disputes over doubtful things." Who of you, anybody have the King James Version? What does yours say? Dispensation? Okay. Has anybody else got the word scruples? Okay. What do you think of when you think of the word scruples? It's not really a word that we use anymore, but what do you think of when you think of scruples? Is anybody willing to try to tackle that definition? Cheap, okay. Maybe. Okay. Got their opinions of what things should cost, what you should spend for something? Okay. So if you've got scruples, you've got strong opinions of things. Okay? I think I can define it that way, and that will work. So when we think about, I'm using the New King James Version here. First word is receive. When we think about receiving another Christian that's weak, that is in a weak state, we need to remind ourselves of our perfect example, that being Christ. Okay? So if we're going to mirror Christ in our attitudes and our actions and our language and all, when did he receive us? When we were dead in our sins. We were buried in sin, okay? The least we can do is to receive each other. Again, Paul's writing to Christians, okay? Christian brothers and sisters. So that's the target audience here. So he's talking to us, okay? I think it's clear from Paul's teaching that a Christian can be wrong about something and still be entitled to our full fellowship. Hey, brother, I completely disagree with you, but you're still my brother, okay? Verse 2, For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. All right, so here we see what this difference of opinion issue was, or at least maybe one of them that he is addressing, okay? And that is of being a vegetarian. How many of you know a vegetarian? Okay. They're missing out on some good bacon, aren't they? good steaks. But that's our opinion, you know. I admire them for their healthy living. Also know others that, Amy and I know a family that they don't eat vegetables 100%. They've decided, they've even got little bitty kids. They've decided that meat and cheese is all they're going to feed their family. And we've tried in a nice way to say, those kids need vegetables, but they're just convinced that they don't. Anyway, that's beside the point. So here we see at least one of the differences in opinion. Now, what it doesn't say, we need to be careful, is that even though it may relate a little bit to this, Paul doesn't say that we're talking about here that meat that has been sacrificed to idols. Okay, that's addressed somewhere else. Now, Jesus taught in Matthew 7:19 that all meat is clean. Okay, so that Jewish restriction there has been removed. Keep in mind, as Linda said, this congregation here is made up of Jewish and Gentile Christians. Okay, so there's going to be restrictions that the Jewish people had, and not necessarily the Gentiles would have had a problem with. But Jesus said all meat is clean. And if you recall, Peter, he made this proclamation in his writing long after the day of Pentecost that he had not eaten anything common or unclean. All right? So even Peter was clinging to this Jewish restriction under the law. Even though he was free from that, he was still clinging to those restrictions. Verse 3, if you come in late, we're in Romans chapter 14. Verse 3, let not him who eats despise him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats, for God has received him. This kind of writing, this back and forth in these sentences, you're going to see again and again in this chapter. All right? So, if I was to sum up this verse, I might say something like, don't get so knotted up in the things that don't really matter, that you put walls around you that keep you from associating with fellow Christians. Different people and different cultures are going to do things a little differently. All right? And again, the church in Rome is made up of Jewish and Gentile Christians, and they're going to have different ways, different traditions, different mindset of the way things could be done. How does that relate to how we may conduct ourselves today? Okay. How many of you grew up in the South? Okay. How many of you grew up in the North? I'm sorry. You can look around our congregation, and we are a diverse congregation, right? And that's one of the things I am so if a Christian can be proud, that's one of the things I'm proud of, is that we have different cultures, we have different races in our congregation. But we got to be mindful that those different races have been raised in different ways and do things that may be a little bit different. Had a good conversation, a pretty funny conversation with Kathy Noble a few weeks ago about a black funeral, okay? And we went back and forth with some stories. I've had the opportunity to experience, and some of you have as well. You got to admit, a black funeral is a little different than a white funeral, okay? And nothing wrong with it. It's quite an honor to those that have passed, of the effort that goes into a black funeral. I'll never forget. I'll tell you this story real quick. And I told Kathy this. Amy and I took Aquila Butler to the funeral for her nephew, was it? And this funeral went on forever and ever and ever. And I'll never forget, and we looked like the middle of an Oreo. I'm just going to say it. Okay, we were the only white people in there. And not that that made me feel uncomfortable whatsoever. But during the service, Aquila kept leaning down at me and getting my attention and giggling, because she could tell that I had never experienced anything like this. It was the best funeral I'd ever been to. It was awesome. It was awesome. And I just kept telling her, that was great. I am so glad you asked us to take you to this. But it was a different thing. I haven't experienced that before. So the point is we've got to remember that we come from different places, different backgrounds, different histories, different parents that have raised us. My parents raised me a certain way that's a little different than the way Amy's parents raised her. So some of the things that she's had to learn in being married to me over the last 37 years, just had an anniversary the other day, she's still trying to figure out, oh, that's the way they are. That's the way they are compared to the way we are. So we've just got to be mindful of that, okay? And got to be not only conscious and accepting of that, but appreciative of that, because we're all one big family. Yeah.
That's a lesson we need to really learn. And even though it's a matter of opinion or scruples as it's used, it's not a matter of faith. In the matter of faith, it's different. But if someone does something that we think is wrong, it might be wrong for us to do. It might be wrong for them. God's receiving as long as it's not sinful and active. And this is what he's talking about. Obviously, there was a problem in the church at Rome of people eating meat, and some didn't eat meat. So, and if you go on down in verse 14, he talks about, that he's persuaded by the Lord that there's nothing unclean. But the fact is that this was a Jewish system. Some of the Jews were still following the Jewish system, even though it had been done away with. So if we take this in its context,
And it's interesting because it does seem, and we got to kind of read into this, which we got to be careful when we read into something. This does seem that the problem was on the Jewish Christians, not the Gentile Christians, because they didn't necessarily have all those Jewish holidays and holy days and all that they had to keep up with. So very good point, Ray.
well, I think it all boils down to pride a lot of times.
Yeah.
They don't question, is it scriptural or not? They question, does this feel right? And that's the problem. We get our feelings involved instead of knowing scripture. Kind of like that.
Well, it's,
Married life, we went off and traveling and see these other, these other countries.
yeah.
And I'm sitting over there the whole time. Is this right? Is this wrong?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, yeah, I don't know why, but that's just not the way we did it.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was nothing wrong with it. That's sometimes, like I said, we get our pride involved, and
And you brought up a good point that we're gonna get to if we have time. So excellent. Let's move on. Verse 4. Who are you to judge another's servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. Okay? The servant here is the Christian. The master is who? It's God. Okay? Who are you to judge? Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount, judge not that you be judged. And it seems that the easiest thing for a Christian to do is to judge another Christian. We give the world a huge pass, but we are so judgmental on our brothers and sisters. Why is that? Is that just human nature? I don't know. I mean, but we're the hardest people on our brothers and sisters, right? Yep, absolutely. Good point. Paul. Yeah. One of the things that I have tried to, and I started out this lesson by saying I've been one of the most judgmental people of my brothers and sisters than any of y'all. I'm admitting that, and I'm close to moving down front. So just go ahead and take this as my can't even think of the word. Confession. Thank you. On top of that, we need to hold our brothers and sisters to a higher standard, but we also need to give our brothers and sisters the benefit of the doubt. Okay? And I think that too often is something that we neglect to do. All right, a Christian, now let's keep in mind, we got to remember this, because people kind of get this judging thing wrong sometimes. A Christian can discern things, can they not? They can discern things based on what the Scripture says. But condemnation is reserved for God and God alone, okay? Even Jesus said when he came to earth, he didn't come to earth to do what? He didn't come to earth to judge it, okay? So we got to keep that in mind. Now, we can privately have an evaluation of our brothers and sisters' conduct, but we're not allowed to pass judgment on them in the sense of announcing a conclusion to others. And I think that's kind of what, and I could be reading into this chapter a little more than I should, but I kind of think that's what he's talking about, is these Christians that have proclaimed to others the fault that they see in their brother or sister over opinion. Maybe you can accept some of it. Instead, what we do is we go to the restaurant on Sunday and talk to everybody else about what you didn't like that they did or didn't do, instead of, like you said, doing the biblical thing of going to them and sharing with them. Years ago, very wise man, he's here, Jim Garner, came up to me after the Lord's Supper, and I had heard this saying. I conducted the Lord's Supper that morning, and I had heard this saying all of my life. But he made me realize I shouldn't use these words. He came up to me and he said, Greg, in all love and all kindness, he pulled me over to the side. He said, when you talked about the blood that was spilt, he said, when you think of the word spilt, do you think of it as an intentional thing or an accidental thing? And I said, well, usually when you spill something, it's an accident. He said, Christ's blood was no accident. And I'm so appreciative of that. I'm so appreciative of the way you said it, and I've never done it anymore. Never done it, never said that anymore. So I appreciate that. That's the kind of thing we need to do, you know. Something that I've heard all my life. I've heard it. You may even hear it tonight, this morning from someone. But I realized you're right. That word spilt is an accident. You spill milk, you know. I don't use that anymore. I don't use that term anymore. So, okay, so moving on. Another thing that judging people tends to do is it tends to become reciprocal. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, you start judging somebody, and what happens? People start judging you, and they start picking apart the things you do. Have you ever been irritated at somebody, or somebody brought up something that they didn't like about you, and what's the first thing that you do? Well, at least I'm not doing this. At least I'm not doing what you're doing. James said it this way in James 4:11 and 12. Do not speak evil of another brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. And then I like this last sentence, question. Who are you to judge another? And I think when he wrote that, when that was inspired writing, it was emphatically said, who are you to judge another? So what's the result of passing and proclaiming judgment on a fellow Christian? What can be the result of that? What's that? Division. And what's the worst part of division? And ultimately, a soul can be lost. we need to remember that God was and is patient with us. Therefore, we need to show patience and love to others. Now, keep in mind, let's constantly keep in mind as we're reading through this, the context here is that of things that are of opinion. Paul's not talking about things that Christ has authorized or condemned. Okay? So, verse 5. I'm going to read verse 5 and 6 now. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. And he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. You can maybe even throw in the world, he still gives God thanks. Okay? So again, the makeup of the church here is we've got Jewish Christians present in the church in Rome that more than likely still held on to many of the celebrated Jewish holy days, and maybe even the Sabbath. Okay? That was a big, big thing. Maybe they even held on to what they could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. Something that they had done all of their life. Okay? While on the other hand, these Gentile Christians, they didn't necessarily have that problem. Now, Paul in Galatians, the same penman of this book, condemned the church in Galatia for adopting and observing Jewish holy days. So why is he saying here, hey, cut your brother and sister some slack when they do that, versus the church in Galatia condemning what they're doing? What's the difference there?
Because they thought they could be saved by the law by observing those days, holy days, Sabbath, and all that. They weren't trusting in Christ. They were trusting in their own system by observing the law and the
And what about this? They were holding that on the rest of the congregation. That it wasn't an individual thing that this brother maybe did or this sister did. They were saying, hey, we as a whole church need to be doing this. Okay? And that was wrong. They were holding these things. They were not forcing, but they were saying, hey, you, the rest of the congregation, need to do this as well. Yeah. Okay, so if this book is going to have, this holy inspired book is going to have anything to do to relate to us in the century that we live in, Does this section just not matter to us? It matters. Okay. What's the season that we just came off of? What's the holiday we just came off of? Christmas. What does the vast majority of the religious world think of and celebrate Christmas as? The birth of Christ. Okay. Does the Bible tell us that we are to celebrate his birth? Does the Bible say we're to make that day any more special than any other day? What does the Bible say we're to, what Jesus himself says we need to remember? We're going to do it here in just a little while. His death, his burial, and his resurrection. Okay? So are we to condemn others that decide that they're going to celebrate Christmas as the birth of Christ? Maybe if they're making that, they're elevating that day over another day, yes, maybe. But Paul, what were you going to say? Is it not a good thing that the vast majority of the world are focusing on Christ at least one time in the year? Desita. We got to just be careful to not put ourselves in place of Christ and God. We cannot judge. We just cannot judge. And the key is we need to constantly remember that the first day of the week is the authorized opportunity and time that we have to remember what God has asked us to do. Again, I am thankful for this time of year. One, because now that I got grandkids, it's the most awesome time in the world to see them doing. I didn't appreciate it when I had kids, but now I just absolutely love it. And secondly, the world is at least for the first time or once in the year thinking about Christ and trying to possibly employ some of those things that Christ taught us. Okay, trying not to get on my soapbox or anything. We can't elevate one day over the other. Verse 7. Oh, we're out of time. Okay. We will end it there. I was hoping to get through this chapter. I'm assuming Dave will be back next Sunday, so we'll let him finish this chapter. We'll drop anchor right there at verse 7, and we'll let Dave take over and talk about the law of love. Thank you for your attention, and especially thank you for your good comments.